Yes.
Oh, third time welcome everyone to this session. It's the last session in a mini conference on socialism in a time of pandemic. My name is Christine Beckerman. I'm with the International Socialists in Toronto. And I want to welcome you to this session on building revolutionary socialism today. So for people who maybe are just joining us, I'll just explain the format for the way we'll do this session. We have two speakers who will each give a presentation. And after that, there'll be lots of time for comments and discussion. And then we'll give the speakers a chance to come back at the end to wrap it up. If you want to speak during the discussion, you can just indicate by raising your hand in Zoom. You should have a button at the bottom of the screen, or you can put a question into the chat. So as I said, we have two speakers today. The first one is going to be a special guest, John Molyneux, who is joining us from Ireland. John is a socialist, an activist, and an author. He's editor of the Irish Marxist Review, founder of the Global Eco-Socialist Network, and a leading member of the Socialist Workers Network in Ireland. And our second speaker is going to be Canan Sahin. Canan is a revolutionary socialist from Turkey and a member of the International Socialists here in Canada. She's an international PhD student in political studies at Queen's University. That's in Kingston, and Canan is a labor and community activist there. She's engaged with the Defund the Police campaign, Housing for All, and tuition reduction for international students. As we start this meeting, we want to acknowledge that as settlers, we acknowledge that we're occupying lands that are the indigenous territories of Turtle Island. Furthermore, we support all struggles for indigenous sovereignty in whatever forms they may take by hundreds of First Nations and Inuit communities that have resided here for many thousands of years, and by Métis communities that have developed in the last hundreds of years. And as we all know, land acknowledgement is about recognizing that history and about putting into practice ways to come to reconciliation. So as part of that, we want to urge everyone to come out for the Pan-Canadian Day of Action in solidarity with the Six Nations land defenders on October 9th. And there'll be a link posted for that in the chat. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, John Molyneux.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you very much to the International Socialists for inviting me, and it's great to be here. And well, if there's anything good we can take from this horrible COVID pandemic, apart from Trump getting it, of course, then it's that we've all learned, I think, to communicate much better across the oceans and around the world through Zoom and other methods, and we're doing it more, and that's got to be a good thing. Okay, so the topic, building revolutionary socialism today, and I'm going to speak particularly about the question of a revolutionary party. I think I would say there's two aspects to this. First of all, there are general arguments, general principles, which are, in a sense, timeless. What I mean by that is, of course, not over eternity, but they were as true when I first heard them articulated, say, in 1968 and after by the likes of Tony Cliff, Duncan Hallis and Chris Harman, as they were in 1988 or 1998 or today. They're generally, I want to suggest, true. And then there's the question of the nitty-gritty of building an organization and building a party, the detail of it, which is where theory meets practice very directly, very closely. And that, it seems to me, is always very time and place specific. And I want to say something about both of those aspects of the question. I'll speak about the general first and then come to the specific situation we're in after that. Okay. In terms of the general arguments, the first thing is I want to argue why it is crucial for the success of the socialist cause, for the victory of the working class, for the victory of the revolution, so on, that we build revolutionary organizations, revolutionary parties. Right. The first argument is an extremely simple one, but it bears repeating, and that is that our enemy, the ruling class, the 1%, are themselves highly organized and centralized in a multitude of ways. First of all, you just look at they're centralized within the giant corporations that they run in terms of as businesses. If you go on strike against a corporation, you know that you're going to have a continual battle to hold everybody together and so on. You will not find the management, maybe behind doors they do, but they in public, you would not find the management taking different lines. They would present a united front against the strike. Even more importantly, they're extremely centralized at the level of a state. That's what the primary function of the capitalist state is, to defend the ruling class against any threat to its order, and it is well organized to do so. It has, its judicial wing, its police arm, its military arm, its media arm, and so on and so forth. And therefore, to counter this centralized enemy, to have any chance of overthrowing it, the working class, our class, also needs to be organized, needs to be able to coordinate its actions, needs to be able to strategize. Now, of course, there are many ways in which it can do so. It can do so through trade unions, good. It can do through various kinds of networks. It can organize through various campaigns and so on. But I want to argue that it needs, in addition to all those, not counterposed to them, but in addition to all those, it needs the organization of its own political party. I mean, there's lots of people who imagine that this is not necessary, especially in the height of campaigns and so on. Not that campaigns are enough, but you can see the necessity of it the moment actually you get to elections. The moment you get to an election, the question is, is there a political party that would represent socialist views that is even at the races to vote for example? And without the formation of political parties, it's extremely difficult to make any kind of effective electoral intervention. But more importantly than the question of the elections is the question of what happens in a revolution. And again, take a simple practical point. If a revolutionary situation develops in Canada and you face the question of how can you defeat and overthrow the Canadian bourgeoisie and its state, well, a very immediate problem you would be how do you coordinate the movement in Vancouver, in Toronto, in Montreal, in Quebec, so that you rise together? That makes a huge difference. If the rising is just in Vancouver and the ruling class concentrate its forces in Vancouver, it's much easier for them to repress it. If the rising was just in Toronto and it could be isolated and so on and so on. Now that may seem a fanciful example to you, but just look at revolutionary history. Look at what happened to the Paris Commune. Absolutely magnificent rising of the Parisian working class, took power in Paris effectively in one day. Smashed the state, or started to smash the state and establish workers' power. But it only happened in Paris. They did not have an organization that could ensure it happened across France. And the result was they were besieged, and after 74 days, less than that, after 65 days or so, they were massacred and slaughtered. Then look at the history of the Russian Revolution. Even in the middle of the immense struggle that was 1917, when the workers of Petrograd were dying to take power, wanted to take power, Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks in the July days, were saying, look, not yet. You can't yet, because we haven't won the country as a whole. If we take power in Petrograd, even though we could do it, we will meet the fate of the Paris Commune. We have to wait until we got a situation where we can carry the whole country with us. In Irish history, where there was no Bolshevik party, of course, the Easter Rising of 1916 was meant to be a nationwide rising. The rising didn't happen nationwide. Orders were countermanded. Dublin was isolated and therefore more easily repressed and so on. So that problem is an absolutely real problem. And you can overcome that only if you have a party which is organized on a nationwide basis and which is bringing together the struggles. It's not just an organizational question, of course. It is a political question of winning a political argument for revolution, for uprising. And it is intimately related to the next central argument for a revolutionary party, which is an argument about political consciousness. Now, as we know, in normal times, in everyday life, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, as Marx put it, or as everybody in kind of academic Marxism today would say, the bourgeoisie has hegemony, and attribute the idea to Antonio Gramsci. But anyway, however you put it, the fact is that their view of the world in normal times is able to impose itself not only as becoming the official discourse, but also to a very considerable extent on the thinking of ordinary people, of working class people who are subordinate to them and therefore subject to these ideas. Now, it is true that in mass struggle, millions of workers can more or less spontaneously break from a lot of those ruling class ideas. There are circumstances in which they can even spontaneously become socialist. Indeed, it is only through mass struggle that that can happen. We, with our small organizations and our small press and our small propaganda, are able to defeat Rupert Murdoch or Fox News or CNN or whatever, that we're going to be able to outgun them, or the universities and so on. It is through mass struggle that that happens. In that respect, by the way, I think, sometimes there's debate on the left about this. I think Lenin's statements in What Is to Be Done, taken out of context, the working class can only reach trade union consciousness, and socialism has to be brought into the working class from the outside, are one-sided overstatements. I don't think that, I wouldn't put it like that at all. I think that spontaneously working class can reach pretty high levels of consciousness, or layers of it can. However, what certainly is true is that rise in consciousness is always uneven and always unstable. It is not the case ever, I don't think ever has been, nor will it be under capitalism, that the whole of the working class becomes spontaneously, socialist and unified in its consciousness, or revolutionary or Marxist. There will be different levels in every workplace, in every community, and so on. And it's unstable in the sense that it can reach such a state for a period, but that can be defeated, pushed back, and so on. So there always has to be a struggle for socialist consciousness and socialist ideas in the class. There's always a battle of ideas going on, and that battle, just like it has to be, the struggle has to be organized, so that battle of ideas has to be fought. And again, you need a revolutionary party, you need a political party to wage that struggle. It's not a question, sometimes people see it as the party versus the class, or the party educating the class. It's that you need an organization that unites the actual advanced workers inside the class, by the advanced workers, I mean the people who lead it on a daily basis, in their workplaces, in their communities, in its actual struggles. You need an organization that draws those people together and enables them to and assist them in waging the battle for socialist consciousness against racism, sexism, or indeed, you know, reformism and all those sort of different methods by which bourgeois ideas are spread in the class. And I've talked about those in two different aspects, but actually the organizational leadership of the class, the leadership of strikes, the coordination of uprisings, and so on, and the ideological, political leadership, struggle for consciousness, are not in any way separate. These two reinforce one another at every stage. If you are leading the class in the struggle for wages or housing or every other sort of immediate issue, you're much better placed to win the arguments against racism and sexism and so on than if you don't have those roots. Now, those seem to me to be, you know, general arguments. I want to say just a word here about Lenin's particular contribution to this, because I think, you know, we speak of the Leninist theory of the party quite rightly, and Lenin made a particular contribution which was extremely important. And Bolshevism, not just Lenin, it was the practice of Bolshevism made a particular contribution. Now, in some senses, you could say Lenin stumbled into this. It certainly wasn't the case that Lenin sat down and wrote a book. Some people imagine what is to be done with such a book is not true. But that Lenin wrote a book, you know, I don't know, 1900, 1901, 1902, in which he laid out the plan. This is hagiography, I'm afraid. It wasn't like that. But Bolshevism developed in a way that was very, very different from other socialist parties. What was the key difference between how Lenin's party, the Bolshevik party, was organized and the predominant form of socialist organization in the rest of Europe and to some extent the rest of the world? It was very straightforward, really, that if you were to look at Kautsky and the German Social Democratic Party and how that was organized, I use that because it was the model, of course, but the same would have been true if you'd have looked at the Italian Socialist Party or the British Labour Party or the French Socialist Party or wherever. These parties, the Social Democratic parties, were actually an alliance between a reformist wing and a revolutionary wing, with a bunch of people in the middle who were not either clearly revolutionary or clearly reformist, but wavering between the two, who had got the nickname centrists, became known as centrists. Germany is the most obvious example you can give of this. You had a right-wing reformist wing led by Edward Bernstein ideologically, and then by people like Scheidemann, Noska, and so on, Ebert, who later on became complete traitors. But these led the right wing of the party. Then on the left, the revolutionary left, you had Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, Franz Mehring, Clara Zetkin, and so on. And then in between, you had the center led ideologically by Karl Kautsky, organizationally by people like August Bebel, and so on. And this was the party. It was an alliance of revolutionaries and reformists. By the way, that can seem very attractive because it's easier to win lots of votes that way. And that was the model. The Bolshevik Party was different for historical reasons that I haven't got time to go into here. It emerged as a wholly revolutionary party without a reformist wing. And this was extremely important. This experience is that it is only such a party that is a revolutionary party through and through, and does not have a reformist wing that can act in a decisive fashion when you get to a revolution. Even if it becomes like, I won't just say that the right wing of the German Social Democrats became out and out pro-imperialist, supported the war, and so on, and helped organize the counter-revolution. But even if you're like the Italian Socialist Party, which was not so right wing, when it came to the Red Years, was incapable, it was paralyzed. It couldn't take the decisive action that was necessary, and that people like Antonio Gramsci and its left wing were urging. A party that is this kind of crossover between revolutionaries and reformists will fail in such a situation. So this is a fundamental difference that Lenin added and that Bolshevism added, that you need an independent revolutionary party. Now, let me stress here, that doesn't, by independent in that sense, I don't mean it always has to be just standing alone. I mean, there are times when you can be operating within broad organizations and campaigns and so on. We in Ireland, the Socialist Workers Network operates within People Before Profit. In Germany, I think Marx 21 operates within Die Linke and so on. There can be various ways in which you can do this. Trotsky talked about circumstances for entryism and so on. It's not that, it's the political independence that is the important thing more than the organization. But having said that, this is Lenin's key contribution, you then, I think, immediately have to add something to this and say that there's another side, the necessary complement of that. And this is that if you are for the independent organization of revolutionaries, you are also for that party and those revolutionaries establishing the closest possible involvement with the class, with the struggle. That means not only just organizing in relation to all the sort of different campaigns that are going on, but also trying to strike roots in the working class, in its workplaces and communities and so on, and making sure that the party does not become detached, does not become a sect, in other words. Now, if you look at Lenin's slides, this is just as much a part of what Lenin fought for as was the question of the struggle against reformism and the independence of the party. You can see it in the early Lenin when they were doing factory agitation around the early factories in St. Petersburg. You see it in 1905 when the Soviets emerged, the first Soviet in St. Petersburg. The initial reaction of the Bolshevik Party was quite hostile to this. Lenin has to argue with them. No, we need the Soviets alongside the party. You have to be involved with the Soviets. You see it in the period of reaction after the defeat of the 1905 revolution, where he is vigorously in favor of taking part in elections, fights tooth and nail against those who reject participating in elections. Even the reactionary Duma, you could actually think about it, you could hear the argument, this isn't even a genuine democracy, how could we possibly take part in it? Why was he for taking part in the elections? Because in conditions of reaction, he thought this was a way in which the party could remain in touch with the mass of workers, and that was crucial. You see him in waging kind of what some people might think was reformist social insurance campaigns to stay in touch and so on. And his, the book that in a way complements his great State and Revolution is Left-Wing Communism and an Infantile Disorder, where he's arguing, the absolutely essential work in trade unions and again in taking part in elections and so on, in order that the party establishes roots in and links to the mass of the working class. Okay, so that's those seem to me to be, as quickly as I can, the general principles underlying the arguments for a revolutionary party and what it should do. Now, there is, of course, a major counter-argument against this that I should at least mention, even if I haven't really got time to go into it. The major counter-argument is that attempt to build a revolutionary party, especially Leninist party, is inherently authoritarian. Look what happened in Russia, it led to Stalinism and so on. I'm just going to say two things about that because I've got other stuff I want to say. It's not true that it was Leninism that created Stalinism in Russia. Stalinism was a counter-revolution brought about by the defeat of the isolation of the revolution, the collapse of the working class in the Civil War, and so on. And it destroyed Leninism in Russia in the most physical sense. It was not a product of Leninism. That's a long argument, separate meeting to substantiate all that, but I just put that on the record. Is it the case that Leninist form of organization is particularly authoritarian? I do not believe so. Actually, of course, there are problems of authoritarianism, bad behavior, lack of democracy in every political organization, every trade union organization, every form of organization that exists under capitalism, because that is the nature of capitalist society. So you could find that in any trade union, in any reformist political party. You know, anybody wanted to see it at its worst, they should look at the British Labour Party at the moment. But all those problems exist. And of course, the revolutionary organization is not immune to them. But actually, I would argue that an organization that is composed thoroughly of revolutionaries who understand the general interests of the working class and is highly political is the best counter to any tendencies in that direction. So I just want to say that before people can come back and don't need saying. So now, let me move on quickly to the question of the situation now. Now, I just want a word here. I am not here speaking about the situation in Canada. So if what I say chimes and makes sense, good. If what I say doesn't, then fair enough. I'm not competent to speak about what the concrete situation is in Canada. So I do say that. But when I say about the situation now, there is an argument out there, I know it's surfaced in America in various ways and so on, associated with David McNally, for example, that now is not the time for building a revolutionary party. Like, you try to build a revolutionary party now, you can only build a sect, and that therefore we should engage in a sort of period of pre-party building, encouraging the development of working class organization and in various other forms and so on. I reject this. I think essentially the idea that in the current situation we shouldn't do anything like that is essentially saying, oh, we'll wait for other people to do it, then maybe we'll join in. You know, somebody else will build this party we want to see, hopefully. And I don't buy that. I think it is necessary to start building, because look at the period we're in. Clearly, we have an immense crisis of the system, quite unparalleled in my lifetime, I would say. You know, we have not seen anything like, in terms of the crisis of the system, we've not really seen anything like it since the 1930s. It's now become commonplace, because it's obvious that we're in a triple crisis of the pandemic, which may recur, may continue and may recur, of course. The crisis of the economy, precipitated by the pandemic, but not caused by it in terms of its underlying causes, caused by the declining rate of profit. And perhaps most fundamental and most intractable, we have the climate crisis, the great rift with nature that's becoming more real and more immediate by the day, and from which there is no sign of capitalism being able to escape. So we have that, and on the other hand, we also have not only this system that is visibly in decay, but we also have an era of massive revolt against it. This has been masked a bit by COVID, because with the exception of the magnificent Black Lives Matter demonstrations, it's been difficult. But if you look at the world in 2019, there was mass popular revolt after mass popular revolt. You know, from Chile to Ecuador to Iraq, I won't go through the whole list, often without much in the way of political leadership, by the way, but the mass revolt was certainly there. And on the other side of that particular coin, we have the fact of the rising forces of the far right and of fascism, exemplified in the, you know, horrible trio of Trump, Bolsonaro, and Modi in India, with Orban in Hungary, and so on. So in other words, we have an immense polarization between popular revolt and rising forces of far right and fascism. So the situation is the opposite of one, in my opinion, where we can defer the process of party building. But having said that, let's also say a rather sobering thing. If you look at the situation of the revolutionary left around the world, it is by and large very weak. I wish I wasn't saying this, but it's true, unfortunately. It is very weak. It's very fragmented, and in some cases it's, perhaps in most cases, not very linked into working class struggle in the way that it should be. Now, let me just, when I speak of the fragmentation, I'll talk about a country on the other side of the world to you, and if there's anybody there who knows it, you can tell me I'm getting it wrong. But my son fairly recently moved and lives in Australia, so I just looking at the situation from the outside. There are two small groups, one a bit larger than the other, one quite a bit larger than the other, who are derived from the international socialist tradition. And there's a third group, that's the Solidarity and the Socialist Alternative. And then there's a third group called Socialist Alliance. That, to most ordinary people, would seem to be pretty much the same, except perhaps it's more focused on environmental questions. All of these organizations are for socialism, they're all for revolution, they're all for revolution from below, and they're none of them Stalinists. And yet there are three such organizations. In Ireland, I'll try and make this graphic. I was standing the other day at a rally, a strike rally. Debenhams, their shop workers lost their jobs. They've been waging a magnificent kind of strike and series of factory workplace occupations, occupying the stores and so on. And there's a rally for them. I was looking at this rally, and the rally was made up essentially of the far left, because the trade union leaders have not been mobilizing their members in solidarity with these workers. So it was far left mainly, and there were four different groups. There was one group, People Before Profit, which Socialist Workers Network was in, which was the largest group. And there were three other groups which were all split off from the Socialist Party, or the Committee for a Workers' International. Three different groups. Each had mobilized in support of this strike, which was a good thing. But I thought, what if you were a worker and deciding what do you want to do? This would be extremely confusing. I went up to one of these people, I think a group that had split in other ways from the Socialist Party. And I said, well, okay, what's the difference between you and them? They said, well, we're still with the CWI and they've left it. I said, okay, what's the policy differences? And they waved me away and said, oh, you can read about it online. Now, if you were a Debenhams worker, that's not a good situation. Now, this is a reality in many different countries. And I think that the weakness and the fragmentation is something that we have to look, I think it's incumbent upon us as revolutionary socialists. If we want to build serious revolutionary parties, to look how we can move out of this situation. That's one I think we have to be seriously talking about. I think we have to guard strongly against the sectarian danger here, that we just say, right, well, we'll leave the situation as it is and we'll hope for the best. I think we have to be looking to ways forward, ways of building roots in the class, ways of getting beyond this situation of lots of sects. Now, that's easy to say in general, but I think I'll make a couple of suggestions. I think that the environmental issue, the question of eco-socialism, I would say this, of course, being, in the global eco-socialist network and so on, which I played a role in setting up, I think it offers a way forward for building alliances on new bases. If you look at a lot of the differences between the groups, I'm not saying the issues weren't important, but they're not the right issues on which we should be divided today. I mean, I think that the question of the class nature of the Soviet Union, was it a worker state or state capitalist was important, remains important, and theoretically it's very important, and I'm willing to discuss it and debate it with anybody. I don't think it's the basis on which you build one workers' party versus another workers' party at the moment. I think we have to get beyond those, and I think the question of eco-socialism and how we respond to the extreme crisis of climate change and the metabolic rift with nature is one basis for it. I think also that we need to insofar as you can get roots in the class, this also becomes a possibly a lever for building unity with other groups. I'm hoping in Ireland that through People Before Profit, which does have some roots in the working class, we're going to be able to reduce that number of 4 different groups outside Debenhams to one much bigger one, or etc. I hope through possible mergers and so on with one of the groups, Rise, who have a MP, a TD, and so on. Now, I'm not trying to say to you in Canada or to anybody else I know how to do this. I'm saying we should all be thinking about it, because I think that the situation is so urgent. The party must be built if we're going to win the revolution, and the revolution is essential if humanity is going to survive. We're not going to face barbarism. So I think we have to be trying to see how we can move beyond the situation we're in. Obviously, I'd ask anybody who even half agrees with what I'm saying here to join the International Socialists in Canada and be part of this process. And I look forward to hearing what other people think. Sorry, I've talked too long. I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Our next speaker is Canan.
Yeah. Thank you very much. First, I'd like to start by saying thank you to all comrades who presented a revolutionary understanding of distinctive but interlocked aspects of multiple crises of capitalism today. And I also want to say that I am honored to be sharing this panel with Comrade John Molyneux, whose writings have contributed a lot to the formation of a generation of socialist cadres like myself, who was in Turkey until 3 years ago trying to build a party there. And one outcome of being a migrant student and an academic worker as an organized socialist back in Turkey and here in Canada, I guess, like constantly making comparisons among the circumstances that revolutionary organizations are trying to broaden themselves in. And internationalism, the core principle of revolutionary Marxism, takes a form of a real physical and mental mobility between spaces. And with it an interest to connect the nodes in the global capitalism, in terms of the scale of resistance, involvement of the working class, the response of the ruling classes, and the strength of the revolutionary ideas in the movements, and the strength of the revolutionary organizing itself. I'm from Turkey, and my partner is from southern India, and we are in Canada now. So we look at, the resistance of the Dalit movement in India, the immense working class, strikes happening in India, and also the increasing power of the Modi regime. We look at the crackdown of the Turkish states on the Kurdish liberation. At the same time, the crisis of authoritarianism and capitalism worsened with the pandemic situation in Turkey. And we also here see, like an upsurge of revolts, resistance of the Black Lives Matter movement, also indigenous resistance, also teacher strikes, and the movement in the education sector. So we find ourselves in a political landscape ridden with contradictions and struggles. So like trying to make sense of why in the region of Karabakh, there is a war now between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in which a lot of imperialist forces, sub-imperialist and global powers, want to intervene, and to understand what happened in Syria, the civil war, and all the, refugee outflow, which we now see like creating, kind of a humanitarian disaster, but also systemic failure to address this disaster in the Mediterranean Sea and within the borders of many neighboring countries and European countries, even in Canada as well. So the reason why I listed, different manifestations of social unrest, global disorder, and ruling class responses is that, without a theory that attempts to explain these particular instances and the phenomena in its totality, which would imply, like a practice that can help us to seek emancipation from this horrific destructive system, it is highly likely for people to be soaked in their own locality, to be limited by the understanding of social reality around themselves, and which would definitely constrain our ability to make interventions, to fight for radical change, and to strategize our practices. So the task is, as John rightfully said, is to connect the struggles in Canada, between Vancouver, in, like different provinces here, when a movement is, being fermented across the country, but also fermenting the movements across the globe and learning lessons from them. And it is only possible, I think, through an organized force, which can record the lessons, which can disseminate the ideas about those lessons to the those who are involved in the movement, be it working class movement, be it youth activism, be it student movement, movement against climate change, movement against racism. It's only an organized, coordinated force can afford to do. So understanding the totality of the capitalism, I think in the previous sessions we have heard wonderful presentations on that can unite theory and practice is crucial. Why? Because, in the movements that we find ourselves, in which we find ourselves, we also see competing ideas, about how to achieve change, right? And in the absence of revolutionary organizations, it is usually the reformist ideas that take over. And sometimes when these radical reformist ideas are organically linked with the movements, we of course support the radical spirit of the movement and radical reforms, but we always know that, as John said, the system we live in is an organized system with a centralized state power, and the decisions are not usually made in parliaments, but decisions are usually made in the boardrooms by people who are unelected. And there is a limit to reforms and experiences that we have seen in Europe. Actually are concrete examples. Also, of course, the lessons that we learned from the German, like revolutionary period and counter-revolution, and other historical examples, in the 20th century. So we have seen, like the rise of radical reformism in Greece, and for 5 years Syriza was in power. It came to power, like just with its back, like 32 general strikes and immense mobilization of the working class. But we saw, taking the state power as it is, it's not enough to affect change. And the same party who was proposing to introduce radical reforms, changes, break up from Troika, international financial institutions, the credit system, became the same agents to introduce such policies of austerity and crack down on working class movement itself. And within its border, we also have seen tragedy of the refugee camps and the complicity of the Greek state within the European Union's policies in general. So this is the kind of world we live in now. The movements, are asking for clarity, clear ideas, but at the same time, there is a radicalization happening on our ranks. And I think John made a very good point, because this reformist consciousness, maybe it's not the maximum consciousness that the oppressed attain in the absence of revolutionary organizing, because spontaneous movement, when the crisis is really deep in the system and when people are really disappointed with the establishment, can take radical forms and radical level of consciousness. Even the organized socialists are not a very active and big part of the movement, but still, it is only with the organization of those ideas, in a way that when the movements seek ways to go ahead, when movements try to strategize, that is needed, you know. So we need to organize in this period of radicalization. And it is obvious, you know, like lots of people have made the emphasis today in the conference, you know, the ruling class is not in a stable state of like affairs of governance. So we can see their ranks are also split. There's an uncertainty on their parts. On one hand, we see scapegoating immigrants, refugees, like empowering far-right fascist organizations from their ranks. On the other hand, there is still, you know, like liberals, Democrats, they're trying to rescue the status quo, the business as usual, and try to keep things going. But they are not able to actually articulate their policies so clearly. Here in Canada, we have seen in the pandemic period, they introduced CRB, you know, some benefits to be given to the unemployed, the working class, but it was a limited period, and it was just to actually remedy the shortcomings of the employment insurance model, and it is over now. And they have provided subsidies to the private companies, the oil companies, much more than they did to the working class. And as Joseph Chonara in his latest article argues, we have witnessing, you know, a rising amount of debt in public and private level. And the ruling classes now are on the verge of, on the brink of a historic recession, which might, you know, like lead to an immense scale of unemployment. And Michael Roberts says like 2/3 of the global working class have been affected by that. And with that, of course, a radical need for a radical restructuring of the system, which we saw in the 1980s. So such a clear understanding can only, I think, help us to make sense of the political and economic developments and the responses of the ruling classes in the world. So I want to just make a couple of points, you know, when it comes to why we need the revolutionary organizing, in addition to what I have said so far. First of all, the state, you know, the centralized state, which is holding coercive instruments, as well as judiciary, you know, like legislature, other branches. It is centralized, so we need to organize. And in the movement, in addition to reformist ideas, what we see also like a prevalence of ideas of autonomy. So we can create autonomous zones. The state is powerful, strong there, but if we enact a vision of an alternative world, a collective autonomously, so we can cherish that and we can show an alternative to the existing system. And we have seen, I think, in the experiments in Seattle and before in the rest of the world, that such experiments actually can easily be cracked down by the system. So we cannot escape from the duty of organizing the entirety of the working class. It cannot be like a solution at the very radical conjuncture of the movement of a limited number of people in a locality. So we have to consider mobilizing our ranks. That's why the lesson, you know, like about the July in Russia is important. When is the write down? What is the next thing to do? What is our strategy should be? These are important questions. Secondly, of course, ruling ideas are the dominant ideas are the ideas of the ruling classes, and we do not have a homogeneous working class. And in the workplaces, in unions, in non-unionized sectors as well, there is a constant fight between the ideas that are uniting the working class, or that are candidates to unite the potentially uniting working class, like anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia. Like pro-indigenous sovereignty, anti-settler colonialism. So these ideas are also fighting with the rest of the class. So we cannot just constrain ourselves as individuals having such debates in our workplaces without connecting it to a larger effort, you know, like happening in other workplaces, other campuses, other places. So we need to do it in an organized way so that we can increase our capacity and we can make interventions at critical conjunctures, like when the movements erupt. And the next, important point maybe to make at this point is, what are the priorities of the organization? So again, John kind of made this emphasis, like globally, we have the problem of left not being organized enough and being scattered and fragmented mostly. And we have seen the weakness of revolutionary organizing actually is a problem for which the revolutionary movements and working classes pay the price, because in Egypt we have seen, like when the revolution happened, the next step, like what to do with the military, what to do with the other organizations that emerged from the uprising. When these questions were not addressed, like through an organized political force, and when there's no clear direction, we see old forces taking power. In Sudan, like we have seen such questions on the table when the Sudanese revolution happened, and this is a contemporary question. So we are not talking about, when we say uprising, revolutions, like only October revolution, or uprisings happened in the past. Since not only 2019, we have seen different episodes, but we are in an age of revolt, which sometimes turn into revolutions, and which definitely requires an organized force of the working class of its own to help the working class in their fight for self-emancipation. And so what we need to do practically, it is one of the important maybe questions. First of all, the priority here maybe in Canada, so we should definitely be very active in the movements against racism, against fascism. We should be very active in the movements that support indigenous sovereignty. October the 9th, our comrades, made the call for that. We should be actively engaging in that. We should be actively building the movement against climate meltdown, crisis, and some of our comrades are really at the heart of that struggle in the localities where they are. But while doing that, how should we behave? Because it is, as a small organization, what John said, as like a sect problem or micro-sect problem, maybe in the history of debates in North America, that term is like, so the working class does not have a vanguard or like an improved layer of itself. That's why organizing a party at this stage means actually trying to build a sect which substitute itself for the vanguard working class, which ends up being kind of a sectarian affair. I think it is very similar to the logic of staged revolution once, like Stalinists had, right? So first we will have a vanguard layer of working class improving, and then within that a revolutionary organizing can emerge. First, the historical speed of the events definitely disproves what this says. Like what we see in the US, partly in Canada and elsewhere, in Belarus, in Lebanon, in Bolivia now, the oppressed take to the street, and the class anger express itself in different ways. And we cannot have a staged understanding of party building, organizational building. Even if we are small, we should be actively, visibly, without hiding our identities, should be part of those movements. Discussions can be difficult, or recruiting people can be difficult. Nonetheless, we cannot just escape from that duty. Because if you escape, you become sectarian. If you become quiet, you are an opportunist. So that's what Tony Cliff was actually saying about party organizing. In the article, actually, John Molyneux was writing, I think he was citing that. And so the need for clarity of ideas and the need for organizing the most advanced consciousness in the movement is a pressing need that we have to take up, and we have to implement that. So in order to be able to break away from the logic of capitalism, in order to heal the metabolic rift, like that's now like putting, like all the, not only the capitalist system, but our relationship with nature in crisis. And in order to create a system of collective ownership and care, so we need socialist organizing. Otherwise, meaningfully, we can engage in politics on an individual basis, but it won't be easy to be part of the trajectory of those movements, like by affecting change and making the right ideas at the right time to change the course of the events happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Canan, and John as well. Sorry. We have time now for questions, comments. I already see a couple names, so let's just jump in. Noel.
All right. Let's see, let me just make sure my video's on as the clock is ticking. Yeah, so, yeah, and the whole thing of like, I think John was mentioning like, the various Trotskyist organizations, like what's the difference between you and all that? Like, yeah. So some of the situation in the United States, the various Trotskyist organizations, like say Marx 21 compared with the Revolutionary Socialist Network. The latter is very much multi-Trotsky. Some more orthodox Trots like Socialist Resurgence who broke off or were expelled by bad leadership in socialist action. Workers' Voice, which I think also has its own international affiliations, and a number of groups that basically survived the ISO's collapse due to like having strong enough rank and file to maintain cohesion. Yeah, and like the latter, their politics are still fairly close to ours. Like had my roommates and I moved to Seattle instead of Portland last year, so I'd probably be a member of Seattle Revolutionary Socialists right now instead of Marx 21. But yeah, I don't really see like Marx 21 formally affiliating the RSN anytime soon. I mean, there are historical reasons there, like there's still some of that unfortunate but understandable mutual distrust between parts of the former ISO and the IST. But I still like seeing Trotskyists talking to each other and knowing what each other are doing. It's like, well, full organizational recruitment, reunification probably only come from like joint participation in like pitch struggle. Having that participation in there and at least talking to each other is like, okay, that helps us map the terrain and know who else is out there, what they're doing, and like who to get together with, like in united fronts, whether local or national level. And, even farther afield though, like until like those material conditions come around to the point where like the important agreements and disagreements come to the fore and the less important ones are just like winnowed out. Like we need to be, building and participating in united fronts, more than just, our Trotskyist cousin groups, like the saner Marxist-Leninist, Stalinist types, like Workers' World perhaps, or even like DSA or various local organizations that are more around like single issues and such, reformist labor organizations, etc. Because like that, in a position where like we don't really have any mass organization, much less, even one that's like, at a minority like the European communists were in the 20s. Yeah, like building those united fronts is actually like how we can win people over. put our politics on display in action, convince people of how, of our political line, or, organizations, where like it's mainly historical, or, the differences aren't, the historical differences and some of the shades of nuance aren't quite as important, in the particular moment, in a revolutionary moment. Like that also shows there what's important, and I think that's probably how we end up getting more of the left unity there. Let's see.
Ask you to
Not
wind up, Noel. We've got a bunch of people on the list.
okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. But yeah, getting involved in struggle, united fronts with all sorts of organizations on the left. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And just to say, we do have quite a few people, so if people want to try to keep their comments brief, Carolyn.
Yeah, thanks very much. This is a hugely important discussion here, and thank you both for your presentations. I think that the rationale for why we need a revolutionary organization at this juncture, any juncture for that matter, was very succinctly put forward, and I think very clearly put forward, and is a great argument. And I think the whole question of reformist consciousness that's out there, how we have to be embedded in the class, embedded in the movements. We are a small organization. We're not large if you look at others around the world. But I think, and I can speak mostly about Toronto, where our membership is very much involved in the trade unions, where people work. We have a lot of trade union members. The United Steelworkers, I think we have something like 9 or 10. And in other movements, the climate justice, the anti-racist movements, we are there. And the whole question is, how do we build a connection? And I think both of you said it in different ways. If you're in a trade union and you are a strong fighter on the shop floor for people who are, need grievances fought, fight against the boss, etc. When you have that reputation, or you have it on the ground in the community, then people are going to look to you for ideas as well. If you abstain from that, then you have no credibility. But you look at they look to you because they see you're a militant, having their back on so many different issues. And then they start, I think, if you have a newspaper, if you have the suggestions you put forward at a meeting, at a local union meeting, or in a meeting of looking for strategies of how do we best fight racism, for example, like what happened over in the park in the East End of Toronto, build a united front, connect with the Black Action Defense Committee, connect with the Coalition of Black Trade Unions, the local mosque, the Bangladeshi community that's there. These are the strategies, I think, that are informed by our politics and our principles of Marxist organizing. And it then provides an opening for, we have our paper, we have our literature, we have our propaganda, and we are seen as excellent activists. And what informs us, and you engage in people and talk to people about why then, if capitalism is the issue, if we see racism or whatever we're talking about, the climate question, totally embedded in capitalism today, how do then we take it over? We can fight for the reforms, we can fight for everything that's oppressing people right now, but how in the end do we really take that on? And I think taking on capitalism, and how do you do it in a way that can succeed? And I think the arguments put forward by both of you show us how we can succeed, why we need an organization, a revolutionary organization that has the most active people in the class, in all the diversity of our class, particularly in the cities of this country. And I think we need, and because people don't automatically go to that question, I'll end up here, they don't, because they see themselves in the movement, they see they're good activists, but how do we bring people to that understanding of we need something above and beyond the movement? We need something that's embedded in the movement, but something will bring all those activists together. And I think that's the project we're involved in. And I think this particular session was, to my mind, extremely helpful in putting the arguments forward and allowing us to continue that task.
You're muted.
Sorry about that feeling.
Oh, okay, sorry. Oops. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about what John was talking about when he talked about what are the contributions of someone like Lenin, or the whole notion of what Bolshevism represented. And I think it was really important that he was basically talking about it not being a question of sitting down in a room and writing down what are the principles of the Bolshevik Party. But if you actually look organically at how the Bolsheviks organized what they did, it sort of, when Rohit was talking about, if you look at the moment that we're in, it is a moment. Maybe it's not a revolutionary moment. It's definitely a moment of crises for the system. It's a moment of revolts across the globe, really, against the system and what capitalism represents. But the leadership of those movements are the people, as he was saying, most directly affected, or most you know, if you look at Black Lives Matter, if you look at movements for indigenous sovereignty, etc., if you look at even the workers' movement, and who are the workers that are really at the sharp end right now of capitalism, you know, the so-called essential workers, who are not paid or recognized as such really by the system. If you look at, I think one of the other contributions of Bolshevism, if you look at when they were organizing, how did they relate to the questions of oppression, to questions of religious freedom, of racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, even gay oppression? And I'm not trying to put a 21st century slant on what was happening there at a very different time and place, but definitely, if you look at the way that they organized, there was I think they had a crucial understanding that you could not create a socialist society unless the people who were most directly oppressed and exploited under capitalism actually took part in the leadership of those organizations. And if you look at the way that the Russian Revolution was launched by a group of women who were basically striking for bread, you know, people were dying and starving in the streets. And if you look at what their program was, when the working class came to power on questions of they understood how the Tsar and how the aristocracy had used things like anti-Semitism, the pogroms against Jewish people, to divide and conquer the Russian workers and peasants. They tried to institute things like communal laundries and kitchens because they could see how women were oppressed in that society, and that for women to really participate, you had to create the material conditions where they would be able to do so. On the question of religious freedom, because there's a whole notion, you know, Stalinism in a sense really kind of put a brake on all that. And so socialism became equated with things like, you know, no religious freedom, when you look at the Bolsheviks, they actually went to large areas where there were Muslims and understood the importance of religion for people. They were, you know, they brought in, they made abortion legal in a situation and at a time when none of that was available in any of the so-called civilized capitalist countries. So I think that the relevance also of that for us today in terms of how we organize, where we organize, and why the question of oppression is really central to building revolutionary organization today.
Thanks, Raylene. Next, we have Sid.
Thanks very much, comrades. This is a fantastic and important discussion, I think. I just wanted to sort of dig in a little bit to why we are talking, you know, some concrete examples of why it is that we talk about building a socialist organization and the kinds of impacts that it can have, even if you're a relatively small organization. I wrote something about the rise of the far right here in Canada recently, and we were talking about the situation that we found ourselves in at the beginning of January 2017, when for the first time in decades, we were going to see far right organizations, including certain Nazi groups, organizing marches that were going to be starting at City Hall here in Toronto. And there was immediately a whole series of competing ideas about how to approach this. And as revolutionary socialists, with the understanding that socialism has to be the act of the working class itself emancipating itself and understanding the sort of concept of socialism from below. We're able to intervene in this situation where we had two sort of different threads. One was a liberal thread saying, let the Nazis march, we don't want to give them any more credit by getting in front of them. The other was an autonomous thread saying, we just need small groups of people to go out and get into a punch-up. And we as an organization sat down and figured out, how is it that we're going to be able to actually get out of that dichotomy and try to build mass opposition to the Nazis from a different perspective. And so as a number of comrades who had connections through the anti-war movement, through various anti-racist struggles, community-based struggles, we were able to put together a much, much broader response that was able to ultimately push the bigots off the street. As of about a year ago, they had their last mobilization and they were humiliated. And they were humiliated because we consciously sat down as a revolutionary group and said, this is inadequate. The two responses that exist are inadequate. And so people were organizing through the trade unions. People were organizing through community connections. We had clergy coming out. We had steelworkers flags en masse coming down to the demonstrations. And it radically changed how the response to the fascists was being organized here in the city of Toronto. And it really would not have been automatic that that was to occur. We put it together and we were very, very conscious of how it was we were doing so. And in those situations, yeah, we were working with other left groups as well, because they were also coming out to the demonstrations in opposition to the Nazis. It's one of those things that does seem to unify the left in very, very quickly. And so we as an organization were able to intervene there, and there's a number of other examples around this, being able to make sure, for example, that there was trade unions involved in campaigns around climate change. There was nothing automatic about that happening, and it was something that we worked incredibly hard to organize. And that's the kind of thing that a revolutionary organization, even a small one, can put together in this kind of a context. Having said that, we're now in a situation where masses of people are asking much, much bigger questions about the way the system operates. And they want to try to find alternatives to the way capitalism operates right now. But of course, there's a million different competing ideas that are being thrown at people around reforms of various different kinds, various different sort of sectarian approaches to how we can actually build this sort of revolutionary forces. And so we have, I think, a golden opportunity right now to get past this notion of small groups and to be able to actually build much, much bigger forces. When you look at the polling in this country, in the US, we're seeing a situation where a vast majority of young people, 18 to 34 years old, are now approving of socialism in whatever way, shape, or form they are looking at. And so that's an opportunity for us to be able to actually get past this. But we're not going to be able to do so unless we actually are able to pull in much, much larger forces within our own organization. So part of what we were trying to do here today was to be able to dig into some of those questions, to be able to get people to join Revolutionary Socialist Organization. We also have a new members meeting that is scheduled for the 25th of October. If people want to come out to that, where you can hear more about what it is we do, how it is we do it, and why it is that we need to actually build a mass organization. And I think that the movement right now, the moment right now, is incredibly ripe for us to be able to do so. And that's the thing that we need to be keeping our eyes on.
Thanks, Sid. We've still got a few more people. If people can make brief comments, try to squeeze you all in. So next, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very good topic to conclude on for today's conference, because I think this is sort of where the rubber hits the road. The question of what can we do in our organizing to advance what clearly in our discussion today, people very much want to see is that revolutionary change. And I guess a couple of things just to mention. This is the 50th anniversary, I think this week actually, well, of the development of the October crisis in Quebec with the Front de Libération du Québec. It sparked a crackdown that led to martial law being imposed. And I know there's going to be an article on this on Socialist.Ca up tomorrow. But the imposition of martial law and the largest mass arrests in Canadian history up until that time, I think at the G20 last decade, there were more arrests, but a massive crackdown in Quebec, but also across the country. against activists, against people, nationalist figures, and so on. And I mention that because when Canan was talking about the reasons that we need to build revolutionary organization, that the state, that centralized power and its deployment to crush movements at various points in history, as we've seen, it makes me think about the magnificent movement there was in February to shut down Canada, the Wet'suwet'en struggle, which succeeded in closing down the railways for almost a month. And this just on the eve of the COVID lockdown, which then, of course, shut down the railways for further number of weeks. And you could see just in that one moment, I think, I guess if there's one thing I wanted to sort of underline, you can see in that one moment of a growing movement across the country where thousands and thousands and thousands of settlers in Canada, of non-Indigenous people, 100% supporting the movement in the context of all of the lies around reconciliation, all of the lies that the Trudeau Jr. government has put forward, saying that this is the most important relationship for them is between Canada and Indigenous and First Peoples. This is the kind of moment where you could imagine that kind of crackdown. And I think we have to be prepared. I think, yes, you know, we can talk about the fragmentation of the far left and so on, but to my mind, this is a very minor issue. The far left is so tiny in our environment here on Turtle Island in North America. But there are many, many thousands of people who are radicalizing, who are anti-capitalist, who reject the system entirely, who say reconciliation is dead, as Wet'suwet'en people said in February, and who are looking for a radical way forward. And so I think that everything that Sid said about the role that socialists can play in the times that we're in a situation where they're in the movements that matter around climate justice, around fighting for economic relief, fighting for paid sick days for workers, in fighting to not have the schools reopen when there are breakouts happening everywhere that are putting people's lives in danger. The disregard of the system for people. There is actually a giant audience in there. And how do we fight the far right? And we can play a role in there. Of course, you can be very small and only reach a small area, but that small area is so much bigger than the forces of revolutionary socialism that are currently organized. So I think we have to sort of keep an eye out to, if I could say it this way, to our right, to the people who are looking for answers to the pressing questions of our time. And that doesn't mean we don't discuss with other groups on the far left in those struggles about history, about theory, about all of those things, but that is really a narrow audience, in my opinion. And I also just want to just a hats off to comrades in March 21. I know some months ago, the leader of Vox, the fascist group, the far right group in Spain, went to visit New York, and I think March 21 comrades were centrally involved in stopping that visit from happening and stopping that far right group from organizing in the States. And I think those are the types of things even small groups of people can make a difference, but crucially build off of that with our politics, with our ideas, and with our strategy for how we can move the movement forward.
Thank you. If it's okay, we'll just try to squeeze in the last two people who wanted to say something quickly, and then we'll come right back to the speakers to wrap up. Brian.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this great discussion. It's such a crucial topic. And just in a lot of my political work has been in helping build the climate movement and organizing in that milieu. And it's a very exciting milieu, lots of young people, and a large number of the people in the movement see the need for system change. And and are posing it as a big question and have framed the issue in terms of climate justice and an intersectional way of movements coming together and so on. And so it's been very exciting, but at the same time, like I think we have to be patient around recruiting people from movements like this, where they've posed these big questions, and the movements going forward and so on, but maybe, you know, don't necessarily see the need to join a revolutionary group. But at the same time, I think the ideas that we bring into the movements really help identify the most class-conscious layers of people in the movement, and we can help organize those layers, even if they're not explicitly a part of our organization. And I think, too, that, you know, through the credibility of actually being involved in the long term in these movements and so on, that we can, you know, be influential at certain moments when these questions become crucial. And I think these, anyway, that's all I just like to say on that.
Thanks, Brian. And Chantal?
I think I'm just going to summarize what was basically just said in the last few concluding remarks, which is that I think throughout this whole afternoon, there have been two questions that have predominated. What do we need to practically do, and how do we change people's ideas? And those two things are totally intertwined, and that is where the Revolutionary Party comes in. I was just really thinking about that quote about changing the narrative. Like, why is it easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism? What makes the difference between those two things? Because they can coexist, actually. I think people are imagining both on some level, but not in a real way. And so what can make the practical difference in a small way sometimes, but important ways that Sid described and others have described about the practical struggles that we can win in the here and now that make people imagine that they won't always fail. That is the way towards imagining something completely different. It won't be a total leap immediately, but that's where the revolutionary theory comes in. And I think that's what we've been talking about all afternoon, is that it's important to act, it's important to have strategy, but we also need to think about our strategy and think about our history, and we tell it and we tell it and we tell it. Tell the stories of success. Tell why they were successes. Tell the stories of failure as well and why they were failures. But people are asking now about Black Lives Matter, how does this not just be a moment, but become a movement? Lots of people are asking that question. And I think revolutionary politics holds an answer to it. So thank you to everyone today.
Yes, and thank you all for a great discussion. And I'm going to turn it back over to John and then Canan to make any concluding comments.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you everybody to the discussion. Look, I was deliberately, if you like, a bit challenging. So I didn't just stick to repeating well-known truths, and I wanted to provoke people to thinking, because I think we all need to be thinking in the present situation. Isaac Newton, the great scientist of the early Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, famously said, if we can see far, it's because we stand on the shoulders of giants. And Tony Cliff used to quote this, but he also said that for revolutionaries, there was something else that had to be added, which was that you can see far if you stand on the shoulders of giants, I mean Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and so on one condition, and that is that you open your eyes. And I think that is the right attitude for that revolutionary socialists should take to the Marxist tradition and to the arguments that we develop. We have to, the party has to be the memory of the class. It has to absorb all that sort of stuff, but and know it. It's not that you can do without it, but we also have to understand how the things are changing and how we can understand the world we're living in and move forward. And I think that that's crucial for us all. Now, respond to some of the particular things that were raised. No, at the beginning, I emphasized, and I think everybody else did as well, the importance of working in united fronts. And I think that's crucial always for how revolutionaries have to operate, and especially for the present time, that we have to be working with and alongside other people who we agree with on a lot, but we also disagree with on other things. And if you can't do that, you're not really doing the job of a revolutionary. Working alongside people is extremely important. I think, though, that some of the other problems that Noel referred to illustrate, if you like, some of the difficulties. For example, I don't think that the way forward for us, and here I agree with Michelle, lies in sort of, you know, we just got to get all the Trotskyists together. In fact, I'm not at all sure. I am, in a sense, an enormous admirer of Trotsky, and in a sense a Trotskyist, but I don't think that's the basis for organization in the present time. You know, can you get all the Trotskyists together? I don't think that at all. But I was also noted something else Noel referred to, which is there are groups who don't want to work with each other for historical reasons. Now, there's different kinds of historical reasons. There's the historical reason that they're reformists and we're revolutionaries. They supported the First World War and we didn't. They opposed the Russian Revolution, or they drowned the Russian Revolution in blood, and we resisted that. Well, there's historical reasons, like we had a falling out 8 years ago about something or other. And I think we need to distinguish, because I think we're all going to have to get beyond the second kind of historical reason. That's not, as I say, for an argument for focusing on Trotsky's regroupment, but I think we have to get beyond that, certainly in our thinking. Several points that were made, I think I wanted to refer to. Faline spoke about the Bolsheviks, and I very much, yeah, I just quote to I see Virginia put up in the, in practice, Noel does a ton of work on the ground in Portland. Exactly. And I agree entirely with what she's saying. I'm just talking, I'm not having a go at Noel. I'm saying that historical problem is one that we have to get beyond. That's a different matter. So I'm not criticizing an individual here. I'm talking about how we as a movement think. Next point, Faline talked about the Bolsheviks, and I very much agreed with what she said. It's interesting here from this point of view that if you, in the academic world, or and to some extent on the left, what is to be done is famous for a couple of lines. Perhaps the couple of lines that were the worst lines in it. And what a great book it was in other respects is lost entirely. I mean, the central argument in what is to be done is that revolutionaries have to be the tribune of the oppressed. And in that respect, Lenin was so ahead of his time. And it's absolutely fantastic, you know, that from defending religious groups, defending the students, or all the rest of it, it is absolutely magnificent from this point. But actually, in an interesting way, I think things have changed since Lenin's day, since even the days I could remember, say, as a socialist in Britain in the early 70s, or even in the great miners' strike in 1984, 85. I remember coming to Canada in 1984, 85 at the end of that strike. But what I mean by where things have changed, I think that the relationship of the struggles between the working class and the oppressed have changed. Not completely, but they have changed. Not, if you looked at, say, the British miners' strike, the question of defending women's liberation, women's rights, was very important in that strike, because the miners at the beginning had very Many of the miners had sexist and quite reactionary ideas towards women, and they changed in the course of the strike. One of the reasons was because there weren't many, because they lived in communities where women didn't work very much. There was also the fantastic thing that people, I don't know if it's shown in Canada like was shown in the film Pride, about how the gay liberation movement and so on related to the miners' strike, and how that's all very clear. But if you look at that, and if you look at Lenin's day when the workers were all in the factories in Petersburg, or you look at the miners' strike, the situation was you had the working class in its workplaces who were predominantly, certainly in Western countries, white men. Not exclusively, there were always women and so on, but the image of the workers' movement was the miner, the car worker, the engineering worker, and so on. And it was extremely important to fight for the defense of the oppressed and championing the oppressed, but the oppressed were kind of somewhere else. That's not the case anymore. There is now no mass workers' movement that isn't quite likely predominantly women, certainly likely to have enormous number of women in it. It's going to have, out leading LGBT plus people in it, in the heart of that movement, on the picket line, etc., etc. It's a different problem. And the question now is, unless the movement addresses all those questions of oppression, you cannot have a united workers' movement. So I think there's a shift there, and it's very important. And I think we're also seeing, and I think what's known, I'm not sure if I say it right, but do I say it Wetsanonen? Is that right? The struggle with the indigenous people in the west of Canada.
Wet'suwet'en.
Wet'suwet'en, sorry. I think that's indicative of something that is happening internationally at the moment, which is that there is climate change, and the struggle against climate change and the struggle of the environment is establishing a new basis for a relationship between the left and the workers' movement, the working class movement in the first instance, and indigenous struggles. And you see it there, and the effect and the solidarity that was generated there, and you see it also in the question of the centrality of defending the rainforest in the Amazon, in Brazil and South America, and you see it in many other places. There's even, if you like, a common interest between small farmers on the west coast, west of Ireland, and people fighting the Mercosur deal, and people attacking the Amazon forest, and people are aware of it. So that's another way in which aspect of this that is changing. Now, couple of other points I wanted to mention. It's very interesting hearing what was said about the question of the far right and fascism. This is exactly the same situation is confronting us in Ireland, and the same arguments, the same approaches. On the one hand, ignore them, do nothing argument. On the other hand, the sort of, if it was said here, autonomous, a few group people have a punch up, it's all down to personal heroism and so on, or a united front that tries to mobilize people. We're in a slightly different phase of this because it's only just happened in the last few weeks, really, and it's complicated by COVID that they have managed to emerge. And the far right in Ireland have particularly been organizing on an anti-lockdown, anti-mask, anti-vaccine basis, and so on. So we'll see how that develops. But the same arguments, the same problem, and the need for us to construct a united front. The question of reformist consciousness, I think, is important here. I think it's very. We need to be clear what reformist consciousness is. It's not a single thing. It's not that there are all these people out there who are reformists. In a sense, we want working class people to be reformist in the sense that we want them to be fighting for reforms. That's an entirely good thing. But what reformism represents for most working class people, I think, is a state where they want to see changes, but they do not yet believe that they can carry them through themselves. They're not yet convinced of the revolutionary option, and so they end up at a kind of reformism by default. It's not a fixed thing, it's continually in flux. And I think our job as revolutionaries is to work on those contradictions and to understand how in a movement we can continually be, as it were, dealing with that contradiction and making the revolutionary possibilities seem more real to people. And I don't know what your situation regarding this is in Canada, but again, I think it needs to be said in the general context that for revolutionary socialists to be able to have a presence electorally, to intervene electorally, and I know it's extraordinarily difficult. It has been in Britain for various reasons. I'm aware of this, but nevertheless, it's something that has to be in our sights if we possibly can, because as Lenin understood, and as we should understand today, using elections is a very important way for relating to that reformist consciousness and fighting for hegemony in the class. Look, I'm talking too much, and I want to conclude by saying this, that I think in all these situations, in the present circumstances, the situation is so urgent, the crisis is so deep, that there are bound to be revolts and opportunities. And the most important thing for us, I think, is to be clear about the goal. The goal is the building of a revolutionary party with roots in working class workplaces and communities. That's the goal. And that we have to have a creative and relatively open attitude to how we try and seize the opportunities that are presented to us, precisely because the alternatives in the years ahead are so appalling, the alternative being really barbarism. So in that, we have to bend every effort to build revolutionary organization to avert that. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And Canan, call on you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, John. I'm not going to have a long, closure speech, just maybe to re-emphasize some of the points. Now with the reopening of the schools and the temporary measures introduced by the federal and provincial governments, like coming to almost to a halt, we are entering, I think, a new episode in Canada in terms of movement. So we see like teachers again being at the center of the contradictions. This putting lives at risk is being challenged, and we see a ban on evictions, for the rental property is now over. So we see the movements about the housing, around homelessness on the rise. We see a climate movement with the September 25th global strike again reorganizing its ranks and coming back to the forefront of the struggle, which is, I think, incredibly strong in Canada in many cities. And we also see, everybody has said, like indigenous resistance going on, and the railway blockages happened, before COVID-19 emerged, had a huge impact, shut down Canada events. And now we see again huge marches, coordinated protests, calling people to street again to defend unceded territories and the sovereignty of indigenous nations. Therefore, so we are entering a period of, I think, struggles which hasn't stopped anyways, especially with the imprint of Black Lives Matter and anti-racist struggles. It was very vibrant and alive, but it's going to be intensified. So building the organization, being involved in that movement, and it is of course good to keep in mind by building the organization, building the party, having it as our main goal, being open, like maybe trying, you know, like how to be engaged more, how to embed ourselves more, and how to create influence, even if we cannot recruit people immediately, how to sustain our influence so that the organization can benefit, you know, like from that engagement that we are displaying. These are important questions, and having the political clarity, having the most advanced ideas are the backbone of this, of course, the process. So, you know, the latest cover of our paper was Capitalism is the Crisis, Tear It All Down, with a picture from a Montreal protest where the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald was toppled down. I mean, this is the radical ideas that can really capture the imagination of the people in the street. So we should be spreading these ideas to the activist organizers in the streets. Therefore, anyone who is in the meeting who is not a member of IS, I am just making a call, you know, like for them to join so that we can build this struggle together and have a bigger impact, you know, like on the organization of the working class and in broader sense, the oppressed more. Okay, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks to our speakers and to everyone who came out. And if you are interested in joining or would like more information, you can go to the link that's been put in the chat or leave an email here. And